Welcome to our channel. If you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our spooky stories. I was just a writer in search of inspiration, something to bring back the spark that seemed to have faded in recent months. It was a rainy afternoon when I decided to visit a secondhand bookstore, a place that always brought me some comfort. The bookstore was small and tucked away on a quiet corner of the city, with shelves crammed with old books and a distinctive smell of aged paper. As I walked between the cramped shelves, something caught my attention. There, on a shelf in the darkest corner of the store, was a diary. The cover was made of worn leather, marked by use and time. There was something intriguing about it, a kind of magnetism that made me pick it up. When I opened it, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The pages were filled with elegant, old-fashioned handwriting. The date on the first entry was from decades ago. I became curious and began to flip through the pages, reading some random passages. The stories were detailed and vivid, as if the writer was recounting events they had truly witnessed. However, something seemed out of the ordinary. The descriptions were so real that I wondered if they were more than just simple stories. I decided to buy the diary, feeling that there was something deeper and more important in its pages. As I left the store, the rain had lessened, but a feeling of unease remained. The diary, now firmly in my hands, seemed to pulse with its own energy, as if it was waiting to reveal its dark secrets. Little did I know, this unexpected encounter with the old diary would be the beginning of a terrifying journey that would change my life forever. Back at my small apartment, I sat in the armchair by the window, the mysterious diary resting on my lap. The soft light of the lamp created a perfect reading environment. I began to explore the diary from the beginning, delving into the meticulously written words. The first entries narrated ordinary events, but the way they were described, with minute details and an almost photographic clarity, captivated me. As I progressed, I noticed that the stories began to take a darker tone. Small incidents, like a missing cat or a car accident, were narrated with an intensity that made my skin crawl. It was when I reached a specific entry that my heart raced. The diary described a horrible accident that would occur at a familiar corner of the city. The date? Tomorrow. The description was so vivid it seemed more like a prophecy than a mere coincidence. It was as if the writer had seen everything happen before it even occurred. Restless and skeptical, I decided I needed to check for myself. The next day, I went to the mentioned corner, feeling foolish and a bit paranoid. I waited for hours, until suddenly, a runaway car appeared, colliding with another vehicle exactly as described in the diary. I stood there in shock, unable to process what I had just witnessed. I went home with my mind racing, gripping the diary tighter than ever. The words written there were not just stories, they were predictions. And, from what I had just witnessed, terribly accurate predictions. I felt a mix of fear and fascination as I flipped through the remaining pages, anxious and fearful of what else the diary might reveal. After witnessing the accident, my world turned upside down. I couldn't shake the chilling accuracy with which the diary had described the event. I felt a constant knot in my stomach, a growing fear of what else those pages might contain. I sat back in the armchair, now with a sense of urgency. I flipped through the pages quickly, searching for more predictions. As I read, I realized that the events were becoming more specific and terrifying. One entry, in particular, described a fire that would destroy a house on a street I knew well. The date? A week from now. My heart raced as I thought about what to do. I decided to investigate further. The street mentioned in the diary was near the home of a childhood friend, Marcos. I visited Marcos and, with a feeling of embarrassment and dread, told him about the diary and the prediction. He laughed, thinking it was just another of my quirks as a writer. Still, I promised myself that I would stay alert, ready to intervene if something happened. The week passed slowly, each day feeding my anxiety. Then, on the mentioned date, I woke up startled by the news on the radio. A fire had destroyed a house on the street described in the diary. I rushed to the scene, and what I saw left me speechless. It was Marcos's house. The flames were still burning, and firefighters were struggling to control the fire. Marcos, thank God, was unharmed, but his home was in ruins. Guilt and fear consumed me. Once again, the diary had proven terrifyingly accurate, and my attempt to change fate had failed miserably. With each new reading, I felt more powerless, as if I were trapped in a nightmare from which I couldn't awaken. The predictions began to get closer and closer to my own life. They involved people I knew, places I frequented, and the feeling of being watched by something beyond my understanding grew. The diary was not just a book, it was a sentence, a sinister shadow threatening to engulf everything I loved. And from what I could tell, the worst was yet to come. I woke up sweating, the diary open next to me on the bed. The predictions had become so personal that it felt as if the book was stalking me. I decided that I needed to try to change the events, by any means possible. I couldn't continue passively watching as tragedies unfolded around me. The next event described in the diary was particularly grim, a violent robbery of a family in my neighborhood, with a fatal outcome. The date was for the next night. I knew I had to do something. I spent the day investigating, watching the house mentioned in the diary, trying to find a way to alert the family without looking like a madman. At night, I decided to keep watch, parking my car on a nearby street with a clear view of the house. The hours passed slowly, every nighttime sound amplifying my anxiety. Near midnight, I saw a suspicious figure approaching the house. My heart raced. I called the police, but I knew they wouldn't arrive in time. I got out of the car, keeping a safe distance but ready to intervene. The figure climbed through a window and entered the house. My instinct was to shout, but that could make things worse. So I grabbed a stone and threw it at the window, shattering the glass and making a loud noise. The thief was startled and fled, disappearing into the darkness. The police arrived minutes later. I explained what had happened, omitting the part about the diary. The family was safe, just scared. I returned home exhausted but relieved to have avoided the disaster. However, my relief was brief. When I opened the diary, I expected to see the entry altered or perhaps disappeared. But to my horror, the description of the event had changed. It now included my interference but with a new ending. The thief would return in a week, this time more violent and prepared. Terrified, I realized that my actions were not changing the fate. They were merely postponing the inevitable and perhaps making the consequences worse. The diary seemed to be one step ahead, as if it anticipated even my attempts to change the events. I was trapped in a macabre game against forces I did not understand, and the feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. Increasingly desperate, I returned to the pages, searching for a way to stop it. But with each entry I read, the despair grew. The diary did not just narrate the future, it shaped it. And I was merely a pawn, dragged by a tide of terror I could not control. The feeling of helplessness the diary provoked in me grew each day. It seemed that the more I tried to change events, the more the book adjusted its predictions to fit my actions. And then came the most terrifying prediction of all, a final catastrophic event involving my own life. The entry was disturbingly detailed. It described how I, the writer, would be the victim of a brutal attack in my own home. The date was 2 days away. The words seemed to pulse on the page, each letter etched into my mind like a dark omen. I spent those 48 hours in a state of constant alert. I locked all the doors and windows, installed security cameras, and even considered the idea of fleeing. But deep down, I knew it would be futile. The diary had ensnared me in its web, and there was no escape. On the fateful night, I sat in the living room, a knife by my side and the diary open on the table. The silence of the house was crushing, every sound amplified by my anxiety. Suddenly, I heard a noise in the kitchen. I stood up slowly, the knife firm in my hand, and walked toward the sound. When I entered the kitchen, the sight that awaited me was surreal. A shadowy, indistinct figure stood there, a presence that radiated pure malevolence. Before I could react, the figure lunged at me, and I felt a sharp pain in my chest. I fell to the floor, my vision darkening. The figure loomed over me, and as life ebbed away, I realized something even more terrifying. The figure's face was a distorted version of my own. The diary had foretold everything, and now, in my final moment, I understood the truth. The diary did not just narrate events, it created them, shaping reality according to its writings. With the last strength I had, I looked at the diary lying beside me. The pages were blank, as if they had never been written. The figure dissipated, and my vision faded completely. The diary had fulfilled its purpose, and I was its final victim. And so, with my last breath, I understood the most terrifying truth of all. The diary was not just a malevolent object, it was an entity, feeding on the fear and despair of those who found it. And now, someone somewhere would find that diary again, starting a new cycle of terror and death. Months passed since the night the diary sealed my fate. The house remained empty, filled with memories and shadows, until one day, a young literature student named Lucas found himself in a small second-hand bookstore. He was looking for something special, an old book that could inspire his thesis. Little did he know he was about to discover a legacy of terror. As he explored the shelves, something caught his attention, a weathered old leather diary. He picked up the book, feeling a strange attraction, as if the object had been waiting for him. Without a second thought, he took it to the counter and bought it. That night, sitting in his small apartment, Lucas opened the diary and began to read. The first pages seemed harmless, but soon he came across an entry that gave him chills. It was a detailed description of a car accident he had witnessed on his way home that same afternoon. The shock was immediate. How could the diary describe something he had just seen? Intrigued and a little scared, Lucas continued reading. The stories became progressively darker and more specific, describing events that had not yet occurred but seemed inevitable. A sense of dread began to grow within him. One of the predictions mentioned a fire at a local college, the very one Lucas attended. The date? 3 days away. He knew he had to do something, alert someone, but how could he explain a prediction from an old diary without sounding crazy? On the morning of the third day, Lucas was restless, watching the college from afar. In the afternoon, He saw smoke beginning to rise from one of the buildings. He ran toward the fire, helping to evacuate students and calling the firefighters. The fire was quickly contained, with little damage and no injuries. But the sense of victory was short-lived. Back in his apartment, Lucas opened the diary again. The words had changed, now including his intervention, exactly as it had happened. And as a sinister mark, the diary had already written a new event, a violent attack in his own building, involving a nearby neighbor. Lucas then realized he was trapped in a cycle of terror, just like the diary's previous owner. The book, a malevolent entity, would continue to shape his fate, feeding on fear and despair. Each attempt to alter the future only strengthened its control. That night, Lucas's building was invaded. He heard screams and called the police, but the diary already knew. The events unfolded exactly as predicted, with Lucas watching, powerless, as the tragedy occurred. And so, the diary continued its dark journey, passing from hand to hand, an insatiable entity weaving destinies of terror and despair. And somewhere on a dusty shelf, it waits patiently for the next victim, someone who, in search of inspiration, will find only nightmares.